The first rays of sunlight filtered through the old, weathered window, illuminating the small room where James Carter sat before a mirror. His dark military uniform, though worn by time, exuded a solemn dignity, the carefully polished metals on his chest gleaming in the soft light. James paused, his hands resting in his lap, and gazed into the mirror for a long moment. His eyes held a distant look, as if lost in a past filled with gunfire, smoke, and the final handshake shared with comrades who never left the battlefield. Footsteps echoed from the hallway, pulling him back to the present. Michael, his son, appeared at the door. Dressed sharply in a suit with a neatly tied tie, Michael's confident demeanor was undercut by a flicker of nervousness in his eyes. "Dad, are you ready?" Michael asked gently, his voice warm yet soft. James smiled faintly and adjusted his uniform. "I'm ready. Let's not keep my old friends waiting." Michael stepped inside, crouching to inspect his father's wheelchair. Though it had aged, its well-maintained condition reflected care and attention to detail. With quiet determination, he pushed the chair out of the room, his mind occupied with thoughts he couldn't quite voice. The drive was mostly silent. Michael glanced at his father in the rearview mirror. James gazed out the window, watching houses and trees blur past, his expression contemplative. "Are you nervous, Dad?" Michael finally asked, breaking the silence. James smiled faintly, his eyes still fixed on the scenery. "Nervous? No. But I can't quite remember the last time I saw those old comrades. I just hope they're doing well." Michael nodded, gripping the steering wheel tighter. He knew this ceremony wasn't merely about honoring his father. It was also an opportunity for James to close a significant chapter of his life, a chapter filled with pride, sacrifice, and loss. "You don't need to worry. They'll be proud to see you in that uniform. You're a hero, Dad," Michael said, his voice steady and warm. "A hero?" James shook his head with a soft chuckle. "Heroes are the ones who didn't come home, son. I was just luckier than they were." Michael fell silent, his heart heavy at his father's words. When they arrived at the airport, Michael carefully maneuvered the wheelchair through the automatic doors. The cold neon lights reflected off the polished floors. The bustling crowd moved around them, but as James entered, a few heads turned his way. Some stared with curiosity, others with admiration, and still others with a quiet indifference. Michael wheeled his father to the check-in counter, where everything went smoothly until they entered the security screening area. James looked ahead at the line of people waiting to be screened. He had no idea that, in just a few moments, the anticipation in his heart would be overshadowed by a tense confrontation. The airport security checkpoint was busy but orderly. The steady beeping of scanners blended with announcements over the loudspeaker. Michael pushed James' wheelchair into the priority line for disabled passengers. As they approached the checkpoint, a young security officer named Rick glanced at James' wheelchair, his expression indifferent and tinged with scrutiny. "Sir, please stand up and walk through the metal detector. The wheelchair will be screened separately," Rick said, his tone impatient. James raised his head and replied calmly, "I can't stand. I lost both legs in the war. You can inspect the chair right here." Rick arched an eyebrow and called over a colleague. Linda, a female officer with a similarly dismissive demeanor, approached. "If he can't stand, we'll need to conduct a more thorough check on the wheelchair." "He'll have to wait a bit," Linda said, ignoring James' explanation entirely. Michael stepped forward, his voice steady despite the frustration simmering beneath. "My father is unable to stand. This wheelchair is his only means of mobility. Surely you can conduct a thorough inspection without dismantling everything, can't you?" Rick smirked, crossing his arms. "Rules are rules. We need to make sure there's nothing unusual." Rick and Linda began an excessively detailed inspection of the wheelchair. They removed the wheels, flipped over the seat cushion, and rummaged through the bag attached to the back of the chair. James remained silent, gripping the armrest tightly, his face impassive. A nearby passenger spoke up. "Is all this really necessary?" "He's just an elderly veteran." Rick turned, his voice icy. "Our job is to ensure security. If you or anyone else has a problem, you're welcome to step out of line." Michael felt anger rising in his chest. He moved closer, striving to keep his tone calm. "Do you have any reason to suspect my father?" "This isn't an inspection, this is an abuse of authority." Linda shrugged, showing no intention of stopping. "If you're unhappy, you can file a complaint. But we're not done here yet." After nearly half an hour of inspection with nothing suspicious found, Rick turned around and made a declaration that stopped Michael in his tracks. This wheelchair doesn't meet security standards. You won't be allowed to take it on the plane. There are spare wheelchairs available in the waiting area. You can use one of those. James looked up, his weary eyes widening in disbelief. What did you just say? This chair has been with me since I left the battlefield. It's my legs. You want me to leave it here? Rick shrugged, his face devoid of empathy. Rules are rules. If you want to board the plane, you'll have to comply. James bowed his head, his trembling hands gripping the armrests tightly. A wave of humiliation washed over him, reminiscent of the prejudice he had faced in his younger years. Michael knelt beside his father, holding his hand firmly. Don't worry, Dad. I'll take care of this. Michael stood up, turning to Rick, his voice no longer restrained. You've just insulted my father, a man who sacrificed his legs for this country. You have no right to deny him what he's entitled to. Rick smirked, his tone dismissive. Feel free to file a complaint if you want. We're just following procedure. How will Michael and his father confront this discrimination? Follow their story to see how they face this unexpected challenge. Subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the emotional and meaningful moments that are yet to come. Michael took a deep breath, his eyes now cold and piercing. Without a word, he pulled out his phone and began recording the entire scene. Then, reaching into the pocket of his suit jacket, he withdrew a badge and held it up for Rick and the other security officers to see. My name is Michael Carter, Chief Investigator with the Office of the Inspector General at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. What you've just done is a blatant violation of human rights and federal aviation security protocols. I will personally report this to your superiors. The security checkpoint fell silent. Rick's face turned pale, his mouth opening and closing as he stammered. Sir, we were just following procedure. Linda stepped back, avoiding Michael's gaze entirely, her earlier confidence replaced by visible discomfort. The atmosphere at the security checkpoint grew unbearably tense after Michael's declaration. Rick remained frozen, his face pale and devoid of the defiance he had shown earlier. Linda took a step back, her mouth opening as if to speak, but she ended up swallowing nervously. Michael, still holding his ID badge, spoke in a voice as sharp as a blade cutting through the silence. Now, call the highest-ranking manager you have on site. I want a formal incident report written up. Immediately. Rick attempted to steady himself, but his voice wavered. Sir, we really didn't mean to offend. We were just doing our job, following protocol. Michael cut him off, his eyes blazing with controlled fury. Protocol? Do you think I don't understand protocol? Security screening is not an excuse to humiliate people, especially not a veteran who gave so much for this country. Linda stepped forward hesitantly, her voice shaky as she tried to placate him. Mr. Carter, we sincerely apologize if we've caused your father any inconvenience. This was just a misunderstanding. We didn't mean. Michael narrowed his eyes, his voice deliberate and heavy with conviction. A misunderstanding? You mocked him, prolonged the screening unnecessarily, and even tried to prevent him from bringing his wheelchair on the plane. I've recorded everything. This isn't a misunderstanding, it's discrimination. At that moment, a man in uniform, appearing to be the security manager, hurried over. His face was tense, and he offered a slight bow to Michael. Mr. Carter, I'm Stephen McAllister, the supervisor of this area. I deeply apologize for what has happened. This was entirely a mishandling of the situation by our staff. Michael's demeanor didn't soften. You call this a mishandling? Here's what I need from you, and I need it done now. 1. Ensure my father boards his flight without any further obstacles. 2. Prepare a full incident report with signatures from all involved staff. And 3. Understand that this report will go straight to the Inspector General's office. Do you understand? Stephen nodded quickly, his voice earnest but strained. Yes, Mr. Carter. I'll make sure all your requests are handled immediately. Please, allow me a moment to get everything in order. Stephen nodded fervently, like a hammer striking a nail. Yes, sir. We'll get it done immediately. Rick and Linda stood with their heads bowed, avoiding eye contact with either Michael or James. Around them, other passengers who had witnessed the entire scene began to murmur. Some pulled out their phones to record, while others openly voiced their support. An older passenger nearby stepped forward, placing a hand on James' shoulder and speaking loudly. Thank you for what you've done for this country. No one has the right to treat you this way." James looked up, his aged eyes glistening with emotion, but he said nothing. Michael turned to his father, gently squeezing his shoulder, a silent reassurance that the matter was being resolved. Once the report was drafted and signed by all involved parties, Stephen personally escorted Michael and James through the security checkpoint, ensuring they received priority to make their flight on time. As they walked, Stephen apologized again. "Mr. Carter, we're deeply sorry for this incident. I promise to escalate the matter and implement retraining for our staff." Michael didn't reply, only giving a brief nod. As they reached the waiting area, James spoke up, his voice slow but meaningful. "If you truly want to make things right, remember this respect isn't something you learn in a training session. It has to come from the heart." Stephen stood frozen, unable to respond, James' words leaving him in quiet reflection. Once settled in the waiting area, Michael sat beside his father, his hands clasped tightly. He turned to look at James, his expression softening. "Dad, I'm sorry you had to go through that." James shook his head with a small, gentle smile. "No need to apologize. I've lived my whole life facing things like this, but today I'm proud because you stood up. Not just for me, but for those who can't stand up for themselves." Michael smiled back, his heart swelling with respect for his father. James sat in his familiar wheelchair, his gaze fixed on the large airport window where sunlight streamed onto the runway. In his heart, the pain of past memories gave way to a profound sense of pride, not just for what he had done, but for the man his son had become. The plane touched down gently on the runway, carrying James and Michael to the city where the honor ceremony would take place. The soft golden light of the afternoon streamed through the small window, reflecting off the metal on James's chest. As airport staff helped guide James's wheelchair off the plane, a small convoy from the Veterans Association was already waiting for them. A representative stepped forward, smiling warmly. "Welcome, Mr. Carter. It's an honor to have you with us." James nodded slightly in acknowledgement, his heart a mix of anticipation and indescribable emotion. Michael helped his father into the vehicle, and the two were quickly driven to the ceremony venue. The building was a grand hall, its towering dome reaching into the sky, with the American flag waving proudly at the entrance. Inside, the space was both warm and solemn, filled with attendees mostly veterans and their families dressed in formal military attire. As James's wheelchair rolled through the entrance, an unexpected round of applause erupted. His old comrades, many of whom rose to their feet despite the effort it took, greeted him with tear-filled eyes. An elderly man with snow-white hair but a strong, upright posture stepped forward. He leaned down, placing a hand on James's shoulder. "Carter, we finally met again. I was afraid I wouldn't get this chance." James looked up, his own eyes glistening. "Wilson, how many years has it been? I thought I was the only one left." Wilson smiled, though his expression carried a deep sense of reflection. "No, Carter. We're still here, though there aren't as many of us as there used to be." James glanced around, taking in the familiar faces. Some looked older than he remembered, others leaned on canes for support, but all of them carried the same spark of shared memories in their eyes. After moments of heartfelt reunions, the ceremony officially began. The MC stepped onto the stage, delivering a speech about the sacrifices and contributions of veterans during the war. One by one, names were called, each accompanied by applause honoring their service. When the name James Carter was announced, the entire hall erupted in applause and cheers. Michael stood by his father's side, guiding his wheelchair onto the stage. The presenter, holding a medal in their hands, looked at James with deep respect and said, "James Carter, your sacrifice and courage are the pride of this nation. Today we honor not just you, but all those who fought alongside you for freedom." James accepted the medal, but his gaze didn't meet the audience. Instead, he looked down to where his old comrades sat, their eyes glistening with pride and tears. The MC invited James to speak. Michael adjusted the microphone for him, and the hall fell silent in anticipation. James began to speak, his voice deep and measured. "Thank you. Thank you for not forgetting us." He paused, his eyes lowering to the medal on his chest. "I don't consider myself a hero. The true heroes are the comrades who didn't make it back. They gave their lives so we could stand here today." The hall fell into a profound silence, broken only by the sound of breathing and the occasional quiet sob. James continued. But today, looking at all of you, I understand that our sacrifices were not in vain. I didn't just fight for the nation, I fought for you, for your families, and for a better tomorrow. He paused briefly, his voice growing steadier and more impassioned. Freedom doesn't just come from guns or victories. Freedom comes from how we treat each other. If we cannot treat one another with respect, then every sacrifice made in war becomes meaningless. The entire hall rose to its feet, thunderous applause echoing through the space. James bowed his head in acknowledgement, his eyes shimmering with pride. After the ceremony, James sat with his old comrades, reminiscing about their days on the battlefield and listening to their stories. From a distance, Michael watched his father, his heart swelling with admiration. Wilson placed a hand on Michael's shoulder and spoke softly. "You did good, son. Your father has always been a strong man, but today you made him stronger than ever." Michael offered a small smile before replying, "He's the real hero. I just did what any son should do." James turned around and called for Michael to join him. When Michael stepped closer, James addressed his comrades. "This is my son, Michael. He's not only an excellent investigator, but also someone who stands for justice, something I believe every soldier fights for." The group of comrades burst into laughter and raised their glasses in a toast. That night, back at the hotel, James sat by the window, gently running his fingers over the medal he had just received. Michael entered the room and sat beside him, both of them silently gazing at the starry sky. "What's on your mind?" Dad Michael asked. James smiled, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. "I'm thinking about those who aren't here. And I think if they could see today, they'd be smiling too." Michael nodded, his heart swelling with respect and love. After the ceremony, the story of James Carter and the incident at the airport began spreading. A passenger had recorded the entire security checkpoint ordeal and posted it on social media. The video quickly garnered millions of views, sparking widespread outrage. The public condemned the behavior of the security staff while expressing deep respect for James, a veteran who had sacrificed his legs for the country, only to be treated so unjustly. Upon returning from the ceremony, Michael wasted no time. He convened a meeting with his investigative team at the office of the Inspector General. In the small, well-equipped room filled with documents and technology, Michael presented the case to his colleagues. "What happened to my father wasn't an isolated incident. This is a systemic issue," Michael declared, his voice firm. A colleague asked, "What's your plan?" Michael placed his hands on the table, his gaze unwavering. "We're launching a comprehensive investigation, not just into the actions of the security staff at that airport, but into how the entire aviation security system operates. We need to ensure that no one, especially those who have served this country, ever has to endure such discrimination again." The team unanimously agreed, and a formal investigation was set in motion. When news of the investigation broke, the pressure on the airport and its staff escalated. Stephen McAllister, the security manager where the incident occurred, was temporarily suspended pending the investigation's outcome. Rick and Linda, the two security officers directly involved, were subjected to formal inquiries. In a televised interview, Stephen tried to defend himself. "This was an unfortunate misunderstanding. Our staff were following standard procedures. We deeply regret if Mr. Carter felt disrespected, but our primary goal is always to ensure safety. We never intended to disrespect Mr. Carter. The incident was simply a misunderstanding in our operational procedures." However, Stephen's defense failed to quell public outrage. A group of veterans organized a small protest outside the airport's headquarters, demanding an official apology and better treatment of disabled passengers and veterans. One evening, while the investigation was ongoing, Michael visited his father at home. He found James sitting on the porch, his familiar wheelchair by his side. "You look tired," James said, his eyes fixed on the sunset before him. Michael sat down next to his father and sighed. "Investigations are always exhausting. But this time, it's not just work. I feel like I'm fighting for you." James turned to him, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Michael, I'm proud of you. But I don't need justice just for myself. I've lived through worse days than this. What I want is to make sure no one else has to go through the same thing." Michael remained silent for a moment, then said, "I promise, Dad. I won't let this happen again." A few weeks later, the results of the investigation were released. The report concluded that the actions of Rick and Linda were not merely careless but discriminatory. They were terminated from their positions and banned from working in the aviation industry. Stephen McAllister was demoted for failing to manage his team effectively. In addition, the Department of Homeland Security announced the launch of a new mandatory training program for all airport security personnel nationwide. The program focused on fair and respectful treatment of passengers, with particular attention to those with disabilities and veterans. At a press conference, Michael declared, "This is not a victory for me or my father alone. This is a step forward for everyone who has ever been treated unfairly. We will continue to work toward a more just America." The story of James and Michael didn't end there. It became an inspiration to many. Veterans organizations across the country began advocating more strongly for the rights of their members. James received a flood of letters and messages from people he had never met. One veteran from a distant state wrote, "Thank you, Carter. You didn't just fight for yourself, you fought for all of us." One afternoon, as Michael returned home after a long day at work, he found James sitting in the garden, reading a letter from an old comrade. "Dad, you're still getting letters from your old friends?" Michael asked with a gentle smile. "Not just from comrades," James replied, holding up a letter. "Even from young people I've never met. They say my story has given them hope." Michael sat down beside him, his heart swelling with pride. "Dad, this isn't just hope. This is change. You made it happen." James smiled, his gaze drifting to the horizon where the sunset painted the sky a fiery red. "Not just me, son. It's us." As time passed, the public attention around James Carter's story and the airport incident gradually subsided. However, the changes it spurred left a lasting impact. At the airport where the incident had occurred, a commemorative plaque honoring veterans was installed in the waiting area, serving as a reminder of the respect they deserve. The Department of Homeland Security's nationwide training program also began showing results, with disabled passengers, especially veterans, experiencing noticeable improvements in how they were treated. James Carter enjoyed peaceful days in his small suburban home. His old wheelchair remained his faithful companion, but he no longer saw it as a burden. Instead, it stood as a symbol of his resilience and everything he had overcome. One morning, as soft sunlight streamed through the window, Michael came to visit his father. He brought along a newspaper, his face alight with joy. "Dad, look at this." Michael placed the paper on the table. On the front page was a long feature article titled "How a Veteran and His Son Changed the System." James flipped through the pages, reading the community's words of gratitude. He paused at a passage quoting Michael. "My father lost his legs on the battlefield, but he never lost his dignity. His story is not just the story of a soldier, it's a symbol of the fairness we all deserve." James chuckled softly, his eyes glinting with pride. "You make me feel like a character in a novel." Michael sat down beside him, laughing. "You're not a character in a novel, Dad. You're the real deal, a true hero." A few weeks later, James received an invitation to attend a special gathering in Washington, D.C., where he and Michael were honored for their contributions to advancing reforms in the aviation security system. In a solemn hall, James, dressed in his familiar military uniform, was escorted onto the stage. Michael stood by his side, feeling for the first time not just as his father's protector but as part of the legacy his father had built. Standing before the crowd, James delivered his speech. "I never imagined that one day my story could lead to change. But today I've come to understand that every small action, every word we dare to speak, can have a profound impact." He turned to Michael, his voice growing warm. "And sometimes, strength doesn't come from within us but from those who stand beside us, ready to fight for justice, like my son has done." Thunderous applause filled the hall, not only for James but also for Michael and everyone who had played a role in driving this change forward. That night, after the event, James and Michael returned to their hotel. The two sat by the window, gazing at the bright lights of the capital city. "Do you think, Dad, that you're satisfied with your life?" Michael asked, his voice contemplative. James looked into the distance, his eyes reflecting a lifetime of memories. "Son, I've lost many things. Friends, my legs, and the years I might have lived a simpler life. But the one thing I never lost is faith in the value of what I've done and faith that there will always be someone to carry on that path. Today, I feel more certain of that than ever." Michael said nothing, silently squeezing his father's hand, a quiet promise that he would continue James's legacy. A few months later, James received another letter from an old comrade along with an article detailing the positive reforms at airports nationwide. Sitting in his small garden, James read each line carefully, his eyes shining with pride. When Michael arrived, he found his father sitting quietly, the Medal of Honor placed on the table beside him. "What's on your mind?" Dad, Michael asked. James turned to him with a soft smile. "I'm thinking about how proud my old comrades would be if they were here. And I'm also thinking, we finally got it right." Michael nodded and sat down next to him. Together, they silently admired the clear blue sky, a quiet tribute to those who were no longer with them, and a testament to the fact that their difficult journey had left an indelible mark on the world. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If you enjoyed the story and the message it conveys, don't forget to hit follow so you won't miss the meaningful stories we share next. Your support is a tremendous motivation for us to continue spreading positive values to the community. Share this story to help it reach even more people. See you in the next chapter.